The singing of the Psalms is such a precious part of the Covenanters' identity. Usually, if people know anything at all about the Reformed Presbyterian Church and the Covenanters, they know this, that our book of praise is the Psalter. But at the same time, there is a very good chance that they won't know why the Covenanters choose to sing only Psalms. And no doubt it is a practice that seems very peculiar and strange to many people. In an age when we have access to thousands and thousands of worship songs, why would anyone choose to limit themselves to these 150 very, very ancient songs? Is it because we want to live in the past? Is it because we have done this, we have done it this way for hundreds of years, and we're not going to change now? Is that it? Is it a bit like those living history exhibitions that you see in places like the Ulster American Folk Park, where people from the 21st century dress up like people from a bygone age, and they pretend that they're living long ago? Is that what we're doing as Covenanters by singing the Psalms? Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. There are many, many reasons why Covenanters sing the Psalms, but a desire to live in the past is certainly not one of those reasons. It is certainly true, though, that the Reformed Presbyterian Church is in a very small minority of churches today who use the Psalms only in their worship. But it would be easy to forget that we in the 21st century are not the only Christians who have ever lived on the earth. And it would be especially easy to forget that because of the spirit of our age. Our society, our culture, doesn't really have a great deal of time for history. We have a kind of chronological snobbery in our culture, particularly amongst younger people. In other words, if it happened before 1960, if it happened before 1990, perhaps even in some cases if it happened before 2007, then it obviously can't be much good. It must be dated and obsolete and irrelevant, and so we're not interested. Whatever is now is best. I think that kind of attitude is around today. But it's not a good attitude to have. There are all kinds of lessons, aren't there, that we need to learn from history. There are many things that were better in previous ages. It's not a good thing to have narrow horizons. It's a very, very common thing, isn't it, in our churches, in our community, in our nation, just to look inwards, to think that we have got everything right and that we don't have anything to learn from other traditions and other cultures. That kind of introvertedness is not a good thing. And it's not healthy either to have narrow historical horizons either. It's not a good thing to think that our own time has nothing to learn from the thousands of years of human history that has gone before us. And actually, when you look at 2,000 years of church history, you might very well be surprised to discover that the singing of the Psalms in worship is in fact the majority position of the church historically. We don't have time to do any more than just a whistle-stop tour of church history, but let's begin with the early church. The great historian of the Christian church, Philip Schaff, says, "So far as we are able to gather from our sources, nothing except the Psalms and a few New Testament hymns such as the Gloria in Excelsis and the Magnificat was, as a rule, sung in public worship before the 4th century. He goes on to say, Except perhaps 7 or 8 hymns in rhythmic prose, the Greek church of the first 6 centuries produced nothing of permanent value or general use. It long adhered almost exclusively to the Psalms of David, who, as Chrysostom says, another early church figure, was first, middle, and last in the assemblies of the Christians. One of the early church fathers, Tertullian, wrote in the 2nd century AD, and he described a typical Christian worship service. And he says that the reading of the Scriptures and the singing of the Psalms were essential components in a Christian worship service. In the 4th century, Jerome said this: "Wherever you turn, the laborer at the plough sings Alleluia. The toiling reaper beguiles his work with psalms. The vine dresser, as he prunes the vine, sings something of David's." Psalm singing was everywhere in the early church. And the great church councils of the first few centuries of the early church asserted again and again the sufficiency of the Psalms in worship. The Council of Laodicea in 381 prohibited the use of uninspired psalms. And about 70 years later, the Council of Chalcedon confirmed this stance. So in the early church, the first 4, 5, 6 centuries of the Christian church, the singing of the Psalms was the majority position. When we come into the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, as they're sometimes called, are marked by a loss of the Scriptures in general from the public sphere. But even here in the Dark Ages, the Psalter had a central place in the church. Another church council, the Council of Braga, in 561 AD, decreed that poetic compositions were not to be used in worship. And in the 7th century, another great church council, the Council of Toledo, repeated and endorsed that. In the 6th century, the Second Council of Nicaea said that no one could be consecrated as a bishop unless he knew the Psalter thoroughly. And it was obviously felt that that wasn't quite stringent enough, because by the 7th century, another decree was passed down saying that no one was to be given any position of authority in the church unless they perfectly knew the whole Psalter. I wonder how many of our ministers would have to resign their positions if that were the case today. In the 9th century, a church leader called Agobard of Lyon reminded his readers in a letter that the councils of the fathers decree that uninspired psalms should not at all be sung in the church. Let us apply ourselves wholly to divine words in which there is no error, no ambiguity. So in the early church, psalm singing was the majority position. In the Middle Ages, psalm singing was everywhere. And in the Reformation, we find the same thing. The Reformation was a great revival of biblical Christianity, when a fresh confidence and fresh trust in the Bible as God's infallible, inerrant word to man flourished. And hand in hand with that rediscovery of the Bible went this rediscovery of the Psalms as the perfect vehicle for the worship of God. The Psalter was central in the spread of the gospel and also the spread of the Reformation. Just to take one example, the Genevan Psalter, which was published in 1562, went through 25 different editions in that 1 year alone. 1,400 different editions of the Genevan Psalter altogether. And it's no wonder, really, when we read this kind of thing. This was written by a visitor to Geneva in 1557. And he says this: "A most interesting sight is offered in the city on the weekdays When the hour for the sermon approaches, the people hasten to the nearest meeting house, and there each one draws from his pocket a small book which contains the Psalms with notes, and out of full hearts, in the native speech, the congregation sings before and after the sermon. In France, Huguenot Protestants were known as psalm singers. To be a Christian and to be a psalm singer were virtually the same thing. One writer says, with the Huguenot, love of the psalms was more than a passing fashion. They became, in a peculiar sense, his special inheritance. With the psalms is bound up the history of French Protestantism. Their translation into verse and their setting to music were among the chief causes of the Reformation in the Low Countries. After the Reformation came to England, the metrical versions of the Psalms were almost the only praise songs that were used in public worship until the middle of the 18th century. And this wasn't just the case amongst Reformed Christians, amongst Calvinists. In the second half of the 16th century and in the 17th century in England, the Psalms were sung by just about everyone, except for Quakers and Roman Catholics. The Covenanters, of course, inherited this noble tradition in the 1600s, and we'll hear more about that later on. But let me just quote one writer who says, no group of saints has ever endured persecution than that suffered by the Scottish Covenanters. And no people ever derived greater comfort from the Psalms in the midst of persecution than they did. And what was true of the revival at the time of the Reformation in the 16th century was also true in the revival in Ulster in 1859. Here are the words of someone writing from Ulster on the 2nd of June 1859. He says, the 23rd, the 40th, and the 116th Psalms seem psalms of power in the hands of the Spirit in imparting indescribable joy. They are heard at the midnight hour, sung by bands of persons, old and young, returning from their prayer meetings. Martyrdom, which is a psalm tune, martyrdom is thus heard at 12 o'clock on the midnight breeze and has a wonderfully solemnizing influence. And of course, the Psalms continued to be very central, especially in the Presbyterian family in Ulster, for a further 100 years. And the same kind of thing was happening across the Atlantic in America. The very first book ever to be printed in English-speaking America was a Psalter, the Bay Psalm Book. Jonathan Edwards wrote this of a revival that swept through New England. One of the most observable features of the work was the singular delight which all the awakened appeared to take in singing psalms. And there are so many more quotations and examples of this that we could look at. But it's clear, isn't it, from all that we've seen, that the singing of the psalms was part of the spiritual inheritance of all the people of God down through the centuries of the Christian church. It is an indisputable historical fact that the Psalms have dominated the praise of the Christian church for 3,000 years. And as Covenanters, we share today gladly and delightedly in that rich and precious inheritance. And so when you take all of the history of the Christian church into account, when you don't just look at the small, tiny little sliver of time that we live in today, we discover that the singing of the Psalms in praise to God is not an unusual thing. It's not a peculiar thing. It's not an odd thing. It's not something adhered to by just a few extremists or freaks on the fringe. This has been the majority position of the Christian church throughout her history. And so whatever else Christians believe that we should sing in worship, one thing is certainly absolutely clear. We should sing the Psalms. And I think one of the tragedies of the modern church is an almost total neglect of these wonderful songs of praise. These songs are God's gift to the church. I wonder how many Christians, I wonder how many here this evening, if you were asked, what is your favourite book of the Bible? I wonder how many would say that it is the book of Psalms. And so isn't it a pity then that we don't have more opportunities to sing these psalms that we love in worship, to use them the way they're meant to be used? And wouldn't it be tremendous if, as a result of this meeting this evening, there were to be a resurgence of interest in our churches in singing the book of Psalms in praise to their author?